Right. Well, this is my Module 9 case study narrative. And please don't mind, it's motorcycle season. So if you hear fun noises outside, just think of them as cool sound effects to my case study. So to start off with, for our case study summary is we've got three major players in this case study. So we've got our new assistant principal, Richard Inman, David, who is 13 years old, and James, who is 15 years old. So Richard is the new assistant principal, first year at Rocket Middle School, about 900 students. He's originally from the south side of town, which has been implied that the south side of wherever this is rather rough. And he realizes that he needs to form relationships with students and is actively trying to engage students and build relationships with them. And super specifically, students from the south side of town, like he was while he was growing up. And then we have James, who, like I said, is 15. He seems to be on a little bit of the rougher side, gets in trouble a lot. He's also from the south side of town. Richard has seemed to identify him as the group leader of the South Side kids. He is suspected of bullying, but he's getting better about it as he makes connections with this new assistant principal. And overall, Mom has just seemed to give up on this kid because of his long list of getting in trouble and shenanigans inside and outside of school, it seems like. And then we have David, who is 13, so probably new to middle school. He seems to be an honor student. He's a band geek, rather shy and timid. He's never really been in trouble in school. He's the suspected victim of bullying in this case. And Mom seems to be very concerned about his outcomes in life. So those are the main three individuals in this case. And what seems to have happened was Mr. Inman has been cultivating relationships specifically with these Southside kids. They all seem to be doing a little bit better. And Richard, Mr. Inman, has really made a bond with James, who is this group leader. And James seems to be coming a long way, getting his homework done. He's still always tardy to class. And yeah, so Mr. Inman is on his way to call in James for his multiple tardy for the week and just keep forming that relationship with him and being a good role model for him. And while James is on the way to the principal's office, another teacher sees James and David have this interaction, and the teacher immediately goes to Mr. Inman and is like, I think a drug deal went down. Seems like you're already calling James into your office. And Mr. Inman's like, oh man, this is really gonna suck. Well, he gets both students in, he brings in the resource officer. No parents are called at this point. The teacher that saw the exchange doesn't seem to be involved past just reporting. And David, who this is his first time really getting into trouble, is about to break down. And James, who has built a relationship with Mr. Inman, is like, no, it wasn't drugs, but it was some other contraband. It was some brass knuckles and some other stuff that I was passing off to David, so I wouldn't get in trouble when I came in here. And this stuff was for after school. I'm gonna take care of some stuff. So James is trying to protect David. Mr. Inman is very excited for James. He's like, man, he's really taken responsibility for himself. I think I've made a relationship with this kid, right? Well, the resource officer doesn't see it that way. The resource officer takes kind of a neutral stance and is like, well, it's a prohibited item regardless. Both students are involved. It doesn't matter if somebody was coerced into this. I'm taking them both down to the youth detention center. And Mr. Inman is really just distraught because he realizes that he's made some mistakes here. So what is pending for these students under a district no tolerance policy is at minimum a 45-day expulsion for both boys, which means they will go into an in-school suspension program where they're still doing work, but they're isolated from their peers. So Mr. Inman calls both parents, and James's mom is like, yeah, whatever, let him sit down in the detention center. He's always getting into trouble. Maybe he'll sort himself out this time, and hangs up. So it just seems like mom for James has given up on him. While on the other hand, David's mom is very distraught, is advocating for her son, saying, well, if somebody else made him do this, why is he getting in trouble? And she's like, well, are you going to file the paperwork? And Mr. Inman's like, I need to think about it. Well, while he's thinking about it, he's contacted by somebody higher up in the school board, and it was like, listen, we have a no tolerance policy. Both these kids need to be written up and sent for in-school suspension. And Mr. Inman is in all kinds of ethical dilemmas right now. He knows he's not really ever had any interactions with David, so he doesn't know him that much. He knows he's just a shy kid, honor student. James, he's been cultivating a relationship with, and there's obviously some other issues going on, not only at school, but probably also at home. And so he's weighing the choices of just not writing David up, which will get him in trouble, which get him a written record on his employee file. But he's not really given any more thought to James. Like, he's just going to write him up. So herein lies multitude of dilemmas. So let's walk through this together. So there are some legal and ethical issues here being experienced by Mr. Inman. And he's gotten himself in kind of a pickle as far as how he went about things. And it was going to be a difficult situation regardless. But so up front, for our legal issues, we've got two underage individuals. We've got two kids that are facing felony possession charges of prohibited weapons on school property. There's potential time in the detention center for both kids. And there might have been intent to cause harm outside of school, right? James has said, I was going to go take care of some business, right? So James may have been facing even more issues if the boys weren't caught, more legal issues, right? So there's those legal issues, right? So both kids are in pretty big trouble, even though they're minors, but they had a prohibited weapon. They were swapping back and forth on school property, regardless if anybody was coerced, right? So the ethical issues here are, should both students be expelled? So we've got a kid with a history of potentially violent outbursts, poor school progress, probably some psychological issues. And it's not his first time getting in trouble, right? And then we've got this honors kid who's never really been in trouble. His mom's super concerned about him. The kid is scared out of his mind. And if he was coerced, then should he take the same equivalent of blame here, right? And then there's this ethical issue of, do we follow the district policies? So even though this is part of the job of the assistant principal, do we follow the disciplinary alternative education program, which is basically in-school suspension? And is that program in and of itself ethical, regardless if it's written into policy? And then we have the involvement of the resource officer. So parents weren't included in this conversation. The teacher that saw what happened wasn't included in this conversation. And overall, involving law enforcement in what might be an already turmoil community could cause some ethical issues here. And we'll talk about that later on. And then finally, how do you help both students? Because obviously, one, the honor student, we've got David, who's never been in trouble, and maybe he needs some support on boosting his confidence or explaining to him why he didn't report was not great. And then also just James, which there seems to just be a lot more going on than him just acting out at school. So how do we help both students in this situation? Because this is not a great situation for anybody, right? So the summary of what is happening or what has happened here is James and David were caught passing brass knuckles on school property, and both students are subjected to a no tolerance policy enforced by the assistant principal, Mr. Inman. So what is happening ethically here is, what is Mr. Inman's moral obligation to both students versus what is Inman's ethical obligation to their job? So we've got this situation and we've got this moral obligation and this ethical obligation to the job and to the students. So what are the facts here? What are the facts here? So we've got three categories. We've got places, people, and programs. So the event itself happened at Rocket Junior High, where there was the exchange of prohibited materials. But then the students that were involved were taken to the youth detention center, which James had been to before, and David had not. So James kind of knows what's happening. David's not really sure, right? And then we've got a list of people who are involved to various degrees. So Mr. Inman is the one taking on the responsibility, dealing out the consequences, doing some investigative research, right? He's the one that's going to really make the overall decisions here. And then we've got the teacher who was just an observer, right? Just an observer, just a reporter, wasn't really involved or seemed to be involved beyond that point. So they reported, and that was the end of they believed to be their duty. Then we have the resource officer that got involved, that Mr. Inman brought in. And like I said earlier, he played just the straight line here. He didn't weigh any ethical decisions. He just thought strictly about what the policy and law was. So his answer was both students need to go to the youth detention center immediately, and everything else will be sorted out by somebody else, right? And then we have the director of secondary education, who is telling Mr. Inman he needs to toe the line, he needs to follow the board policies, regardless of what the situation is. So the director of secondary education, they're also saying you need to uphold these policies, and isn't really weighing the gray areas in between this situation. And then we have the two moms. So here we have James's mom, who is obviously just done with supporting her kid. I mean, maybe not completely, but that's how she's coming off in this conversation, saying, you just leave my son there, that's fine. Maybe he'll figure it out this time. Which speaks volumes, as this is not James's first time getting in trouble. Maybe he's done stuff that's been more troublesome. Maybe the other things he's done were a build up to this moment. We're not quite sure, right? But we know James's mom she's a stakeholder here, and she's really kind of relinquishing. She's kind of relinquishing that, right? She's just like, well, whatever, it's up to him now. And then we have David's mom, who is advocating for her son. She knows that he's never been in trouble. He's pretty young, and she doesn't want to see him face the same consequences because he was coerced. And she's really advocating for her son to Mr. Inman and saying, hey, like, this is not right. You know, this is not right. And she's pushing for good outcomes for her child. And then we have James, who again, he seems to be turning over a new leaf, making a bond with Mr. Inman, but he's still got some stuff to hash out with himself and with his life. And as we saw, he really reached out and said, hey, like, I'm going to take responsibility for this. Like, I made David do this thing. This is my fault. Which on one hand is great, right? He's taking responsibility for himself. He's showing some sort of remorse. But on the other hand, he did this behavior in the first place. And then we have David, who didn't feel like he could say no, is a really shy kid, and he is just scared to death. And he's not sure how he's going to deal with his situation. And then as far as our programs go, we have our zero tolerance board policy, which says there is no black and white, there's no gray area in this black and white. So if A happens, B is going to happen. So in this case, both students are going to get a mandatory 40-day expulsion and end up in the disciplinary alternative education program, so that in school suspension again, right? And then lastly, we've got city and federal laws. So even though these are minors that are involved, there is some enforcement of city and federal laws happening here, right? The resource officer said having brass knuckles on school property is a felony, and that's going to be upheld regardless of the situation. So we've got a whole bunch of layers going on here, and different stakeholders at different stages. So let's talk about the stakeholders here for a moment. So the stakeholders, the main stakeholders here are Mr. Inman, because he has a responsibility to his students, not just David and James, but also the rest of the school community. He has a stake in his job, because if he doesn't write up David, he's going to get reprimanded, which might lead to different consequences. And we've got David and James, right? Their future is at stake here, whether it might seem like a small incident to some people or a really big incident. A felony charge, even as a minor, is pretty scary. And the consequences can follow you, even if it is expunged from your record or your record is sealed. And this is going to really deprive them of their education. So even no matter what, even if James doesn't participate in school very well, we have seen, or Mr. Inman has seen, his improvement. Maybe not necessarily all academic, but seen it socially, his social improvements. And then we've got David and James's parents. So both moms are stakeholders here, right? Even though James's mom seems a little bit like she's pushing off her son, she probably still wants her son to do well in life. And she's just not sure how to handle it. And David's mom is invested in her child, right? She wants him to do well. She wants him to keep out of trouble. And she's going to keep advocating for him because she wants a successful child and to raise a successful adult. And then we have the school community. So we've got the rest of this middle school. And we're not quite sure who James was going to go and potentially harm that day, or maybe sell the brass knuckles to, or whatever. So we've got the rest of the students that are stakeholders here too. Their education could have been interrupted, or they could have been physically harmed, and they deserve a safe school community, right? And then we finally have the school district. So the overarching stakeholder here. So they have the obligation to not just parents and students, but also to their staff to be fair to everybody and have an even playing field. So those are the big stakeholders here. And when it comes to prioritizing, Mr. Inman has the obligation to think about the student outcomes. Are David and James safe? Do the students that were involved, David and James, do they understand the consequences of what is happening here? Do they understand what a felony means? Do they understand what it means to go to juvenile detention? Do they understand what in-school suspension is? And immediately, this needs to be prioritized first. Because you can't just throw out there and be like, well, you did the thing and now you're going to get punished. Because if the students don't understand what the consequences are, then how are they going to learn from their actions? And then we've got the students at large. Like I mentioned earlier, we need to prioritize, or Mr. Inman needs to prioritize, the safety of all the students in the building, along with educators. So is everybody else in the building safe right now? Is everybody else getting the education they need to be? Has their education been interrupted? Because that teacher who reported it may have gotten distracted afterwards and not been as attentive to their class, right? So student outcomes need to be prioritized first. And then start thinking about upholding district policies and school policies. So is the no tolerance policy really something that is just transparent and is what needs to keep happening? Or is it okay for Mr. Inman to question it here? Does questioning it harm anybody? So those are our main stakeholders. And that's how I would prioritize what we've got going on here. So let's talk a little bit more about stakeholders and prioritizing. So there is some information here that is missing. So when considering this story, there wasn't really any information on what the racial identities or the socioeconomic statuses were of the students involved, of the teacher that reported, of Mr. Inman, of the resource officer. Because honestly, that's going to play a big part in how consequences are dealt, regardless of if we want to believe that a no tolerance policy means a no tolerance policy, right? Maybe there's other stuff going on here to cause James to act out. Maybe there is a reason why David's mom is advocating more for him. And maybe the person from the board has some biases going on here. It's like, well, they're this kind of person, so they all get punished the same, right? And so also what's missing is who is pressing charges here. So I'm not quite familiar with how federal charges work. I'm not quite certain if schools have to press charges on students that are carrying weapons, or if those charges can be dropped, or what's happening there. So some more information needs to happen about who's pressing charges. Do they have to press charges? What are some alternatives here to pressing charges? And then finally, for the missing information that I want to highlight, what is the school district's success rate with the no tolerance policy? Have they seen that kids' behavior improves if they get punished just flat out and there's no in-betweens? Or have they seen the success of students fall because of this no tolerance policy? So those are things that I would like to see missing information, because I think those are really important when thinking about this scenario. So next, we've got our stakeholders and who was all consulted. So the stakeholders that should have been consulted first were not consulted at all until there were outcomes. So the parents were not consulted. They were not brought in to talk about the situation before the resource officer was. And that's kind of a big deal, because as minors, James and David deserved to have their parental guardians there to have this conversation, and especially in front of a law enforcement officer. And then the students, so David and James were consulted, but they were consulted together in front of two forms of authority. So there was no real confidentiality going on here. There was no, hey, what happened? Can you tell me in private? And then consolidating the stories here. And they weren't really told the consequences of what was going to happen if they said they had weapons on them. And then finally, the last stakeholder that should have been consulted that wasn't should have been other school admins. So this might be Mr. Inman's job, is to take care of all disciplinary things, but he is a first-year assistant principal. And I think here that his principal should have been consulted. If there was a disciplinary officer, they should have been consulted. Maybe also pulled in a counselor, especially if we know that James has had other issues. Maybe they know a little bit more about his situation. Those are stakeholders that should have been consulted, and they weren't. And then we have some decision making here. So for me, I said yes and no on whether I would be able to make decisions here. So as far as yes, looking in from my outside perspective right now, before putting myself into the situation, I would think it would be easy to make decisions based on my own moral compass. But then I also said no, because I don't know enough about the district or the school that they're in or the area that they're in or the teacher that reported or the resource officer that was there. And I don't know the situation of the students that were involved. And I don't know what experience Mr. Inman has. So I was in that gray area when it came to making a decision about this particular case. And we'll talk about that a little bit more while going through this. So next, we've got some options and consequences here. So we've got the gambit. So we've got send David to the in-school suspension program with James. We've got send only James and be reprimanded, Mr. Inman be reprimanded by the board. Or find a middle ground, which is a mix of both that might have good outcomes for everybody. So the first one, sending David to the in-school suspension with James, we might lose the connection with David and his family here. So there might be some trust loss between Mr. Inman and David's mom. And there might be some trust lost with the school district in general, right? Because Mr. Inman's only implementing policies that the board has put out. And not just to focus on David here, but sending James to probably another in-school suspension. He's not getting the help he needs. He's being isolated away from his peers, not making those connections and bettering his social, emotional skills. And he's not making connections with the admin team and his teachers anymore. He's taken out of school for 45 days, isolated to learn on his own. And nothing gets resolved in his life, right? And then we have send only James to this in-school suspension and Mr. Inman be reprimanded by the board. So this option here has the potential of showing favoritism towards one student. So Mr. Inman, his goal has been to make connections with these kids, and he said he's really worked hard on working with Southside kids. But now, both students that were involved in this incident aren't getting in trouble at the same proportion, right? So any trust that he's gained with James and James's friends and the rest of the Southside kids, that might disintegrate. And then there's a potential for Mr. Inman to get a reprimandation on his file. And that might not look great to future employers, right? Next, James is not still getting the help he needs, right? He sat in school suspension, isolated once again from his peers, from his teachers, from his admin team. And nothing's really getting done with his life. Nobody's really helping him. Nobody's really supporting him. He's still getting in trouble and nobody's trying to help him figure out why. And this should say David. So David may end up becoming more ostracized and bullied while in school. So David's already a pretty shy kid. And it's obvious that he's easily coerced. And if he doesn't get in trouble along with James, he might end up being more bullied. And people might be like, well, you didn't get in trouble for this, so I'm going to give you all my contraband as well. And you're going to get off the hook again because you're an honors kid. So those are the two sides, right? But I think there's a middle ground here. And the middle ground I think needs to happen, or I'm suggesting here, is requesting assistance from the rest of the admin team at Mr. Inman's school. So before he decides to completely just say, well, I'm not sending David to in-school suspension because he's an honor kid, never been in trouble, but James can go, he needs to have a conversation with the rest of the admin team to get their experiences and lean on them for support. And then also in this middle ground, there's the potential to start a conversation with the school board about the zero tolerance policies and suggesting changes to this policy. And this can be supported by data of saying, hey, like, here's the last 5 years of what we were up to with the zero tolerance policy. Is it really working for us? And then finally, in the middle ground, if possible, don't press charges on either student. If that's possible. So those are options and consequences that I came up with. So let's evaluate these options. So our first option, sending both boys to the AEP program. So legal and policy obligations are fulfilled. So both kids have served their time outside of school with the expulsion. They may have ended up in the youth detention center for a little bit. The zero tolerance policy is being enforced. And the students are still getting their education by doing their in-school suspension, right? So policies and legal obligations are fulfilled. But this decision is ethically shaky. So David, who's never been in trouble before, goes to this program. He was coerced into it, into the situation. He goes to this program, he comes back to school. He may end up ostracized, he may end up behind in class. And then James is still not getting the help that he probably needs, right? And so this option really ignores the ethical obligation to students. So yeah, it's kind of protecting the student body at large, but in this specific situation, both students are being failed. So then we have sending just James to this program, and Mr. Inman gets reprimanded by the board. So legal and policy obligations are not fulfilled here, right? So half of them are filled. So James is getting what has been outlined by the no tolerance policy. He's spent some time in the detention center. But David, who is also involved, regardless if he was coerced, ends up skipping out on this zero tolerance policy. He probably is not spending as much time in the detention center as James did. So the legal and policy obligations are not being fulfilled here. And this option ignores the ethical obligations to the greater school community. So Mr. Inman, when he signed on to be assistant principal, he said he was going to probably uphold these policies and keep everybody in the school safe. So his teachers, his staff, his students, right? And also enforcing what the board has told him to do, the people that gave him his job. And then we have this middle ground about opening the conversation about policies and policy revision. So in this middle ground, we have the ability to potentially build a more inclusive, ethical program for students who end up in trouble like this. So we are able to start that conversation and be like, hey, like, I know you're saying this policy needs to be upheld, but is this really ethical? And having this conversation and starting to advocate for this is the more ethical, the more sound choice of the three. So obviously, I think from what I've said prior, my choice here is the middle ground. So having that conversation with the rest of the admin team, starting the conversation with the board and saying, hey, like, I know I'm going to get in trouble here, but I have an obligation to my students. Yeah, I have an obligation to the school board and my school, but my obligation to my school is not being fulfilled if I keep upholding a zero tolerance policy, which is probably failing. So here we have the option to rehabilitate students and open up more mental health service programs for the kids, such as might be needed, right? Especially for James. There's obviously, like I said, there's obviously something going on there. And then also to help David with what seems like might be an anxiety issue and confidence issue. And then on the other side, we have the chance to abolish this in-school suspension program that isolates students from their peers, their teachers, the admin at the school, and establish a restorative justice program. So teaching kids about the consequences of their actions and how they can be better citizens, not only in their school, but in their community. So we've got some decision implementing things happening here. So my plan, if I was Mr. Inman, I wouldn't do paperwork on either student. That would be my first choice. Because I know David's not ever gotten in trouble. I know James has some other issues that need to be addressed. And I don't think either student is going to benefit from being taken out of school for 45 days, sat in a cubicle doing homework and not getting any guidance from their teachers. And I'm going to be willing to accept the consequences here. I'm going to plan to be reprimanded. I'm going to weigh my choices there of, well, is this a fireable offense? Is this just going to go on my record for a very long time? And I'm probably going to have a conversation with HR, honestly. Be like, well, how is this going to affect me long term in this district? And then I'm going to also plan to have conversations around policy change. So these are going to be conversations with my teachers, with my admin team, with the board, and potentially even with the students. So with that, who needs to know what my plan is? So who needs to know in this situation? I would say my school admin team. So my principal, my coaches, my mental health professionals, my counselors, what have you, my disciplinary coaches, whatever. And then my school board is going to need to know, because I'm going to challenge them with their policy. So I'm going to have to start the conversation. I can't be passive aggressive about this. And then finally, who needs to know? The parents of the involved students. So even though James's mom seems to be tired about the situation with her son, I want to get them involved and say, hey, like, your children are involved and I want your feedback here on these policies. And then potentially start to get other parents involved, of maybe kids that have gotten in trouble a few times or not as severely, and just have that conversation with not only the parents that were involved, but maybe some of the other parents in the school community. So what are the potential outcomes here? So obviously the big one here is that I have the potential to get fired, or Mr. Inman has the potential to get fired, because he is not following through on implementing board policies, regardless of their ethics. Then there are potentially legal consequences, right? So since it's potential felony possession of a weapon on school property, if I'm not filing the paperwork I need to, and that paperwork also needs to be included in a police report, I might end up getting legal consequences. But I don't have that information, so maybe not. And then there's the community backlash. So parents are going to find out. Parents talk, the rest of the community talks. Well, why didn't you do anything about so-and-so having weapons on school property? Why did you let them off so easily? They're a troubled kid. You know they're a troubled kid. I don't care, blah, 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 right? So thinking about dealing with what the community is going to say here. But on the plus side, positive potential outcomes is if conversations get started, there might be a chance to change the policies here. And there also might be the chance to create more helpful, sustainable, equitable programs for the students in this school. Okay. So when it comes to whether this is a solo project or a collective project, this is certainly a collective project. Even though I or Mr. Inman is going to start it by saying, hey, like, I'm not writing these up. This policy is silly. He's going to need backup. I'm going to need backup. So again, talking to my admin team, talking to my parents, talking to my school board, talking to my students. And I think here, getting everybody involved or getting stakeholders involved is modeling ethical behavior for staff and students, and also the community at large, right? So if we think something is not ethical or morally acceptable, we need to work as a team to find a collective solution. And then finally, if all of this seems to fall through, and Mr. Inman gets really pushed, said, no, you're really going to lose your job if you don't file this, and you need to file them before we have any conversation. Then the paperwork gets filed on both boys. He avoids losing his job, which means he can continue to push for change in the system. Yeah, it wasn't the most favorable outcome for either boy. The boys in this situation didn't get the help they needed. But this just adds more to the statistics that Mr. Inman can be like, look, this didn't help anybody. We need to do something about this. So yeah, it sucks in the short term, but Mr. Inman has the potential to then stay in his job and keep pushing for change in the system. So we're coming to a close on my presentation here. Here are my references, which I referenced inside of the PowerPoint as well. And then finally, my reflection. So I wanted to give a little bit of background here. I'm not gonna read this. I'm gonna give some more background here. So this case was particularly hard for me because I grew up in a school system that had zero tolerance policy. And even though I personally wasn't a kid that got in trouble a lot, I did see my friends who had a lot of issues going on at home and mental health issues and poverty issues get hit with the zero tolerance policy. And it didn't help them one bit. They would feel even more isolated after their time. They would come back to school, get into more trouble, act out, because they had no support. No support was built in for them. And the school didn't give them support. So it affected me because it affected my friends. And then also, I saw this not work within my own family. So when I was younger, my aunt, who's 10 years older than me, she had some problems after my grandpa died, after her dad died when she was a teenager, and she ended up in school suspension a lot. And I can attest to you that she wasn't getting the support at home she needed. The school was not recognizing that she needed more support. And it was just a cycle. She kept getting kicked out of school, put in school suspension. And it wasn't great. And it took a while for her to be a successful adult because she had to figure out how to build that support on her own. So that's my personal experience with stuff like this. And as just from a statistical standpoint, no tolerance policies and in school suspensions have a long history of not being equitable. And they are a big part of the school to prison pipeline. So these students that are in and out of this cycle often never get the support they need. So in this case, I don't think Mr. Inman should write either of them up. Even though he has an obligation to the school board, he has a moral and ethical obligation to these students to do better by them and to help put programs in place that will not only improve their lives, but also the lives of students in his school and students in the district. And finally, after that, I would say I still have a lot to unpack with this case study. There were some activating moments reading it, thinking about this. And I'm going to continue to unpack this while I probably get faced with my own challenges, right, that are similar to this. And I think I'm going to carry this case study with me for a while and take a better look at what my school board policies are, what my specific school policies are, and start to have these conversations with people in my own building, within my own district, and with my kids. I work with teenagers and they have a lot to say about this. So that's what I have. Thank you for listening.